starting, you have a diverse body of work. You've written short stories, you've written novels. How does Is there a favorite form that you have? Like, do you prefer writing in a particular format, and is it difficult, or is it? Are there any? What's the process between switching into these formats? Does it require something, or does it just come naturally, so to say?
I think one could say it comes fairly naturally, because if it didn't, I wouldn't be doing them, because there's absolutely no compulsion to. Nobody's nobody's waiting to read me in all these different genres. There's no especially not to move. I think it's hard enough to stick to one and produce, anything that counts. So the moving is entirely my own restlessness and my own interest in these different forms. I read very much in all the forms. I think I started as a poetry snob. I remember when I was in my 20s, I grew up in a town called Shillong, where there were, for some strange reason, a lot of poets. Some my age, some older than me. They just been reading a lot of poetry, obviously the stuff in the school textbook and the university textbook, but also we had, at that point, we still have to some extent very good libraries. The university library, I remember, was excellent. So a lot of great, like, modern poetry in translation and so on. European modern, Penguin had a great series called the European Modern Poets. Stuff like that, that was accessible in the mind you, in the pre-internet era. This is so I just got very pulled into the idea of poetry as something that the best writers do. And from there on, it was this drift towards fiction then, because I did write poetry for a long time, felt that it's the only thing I want to do. I look down on fiction, but I think I like Milan Kundera's idea of the poet is somebody who lives in the lyrical age, and if you outgrow that, he says the novelist is born from the ruins of the lyrical of his lyrical self, something like that. I'm paraphrasing here. But once you come out of that romantic attitude to life, and you could keep that attitude till the age of Gulzar, who just had several hundred people listening to him. It's an attitude, it's not an age, chronologically or technically. But I feel that I came out of that once I left Shillong, and looked back at my life as a poet. And then I started writing fiction. Then I worked as a books editor with a magazine. I was writing a lot of essays on other Indian writers and so on. So, yeah, there's been a sort of organic development. And I also think that there are many writers I admire who do all these things very well, who do just, yeah. Just yesterday, I was talking to an Italian writer and translator who's here at the festival. And we were talking about a modernist Italian writer called Cesare Pavese, who wrote both novels and poetry. And I remember distinctly when I was young, I would only read his poetry because I said, how can the novels matter? Because the poetry is so uncannily plain speaking, absolutely the word that Kundera uses. None of that overt lyricism. And I was very inspired by it. And I used to think, okay, this is it. Why would I bother with the novels? And I only last year read a Pavese novel, which has come out in English translation. But he does both, obviously, he does both really well. Another writer I admire is Amit Chaudhry, does both equally well. Kolkata, about, yeah, both in fiction and in, yeah. Then there is the wonderful Alan Seeley, who does seemingly all genres equally inspiringly. Who else? It's rarer now, I think, among younger writers to be doing both. I think things are getting more specialized. But yeah, I kind of feel myself very at home in all. So it's not like I have to compel myself to do any of these. I think it's very important for me to be writing essays about other writers and finding what I think about them and how I relate to the tribe, so to speak. So that's equally important. So yeah, I think they feed into each other in some way. Yeah.
Beautiful answer. So your protagonist in History's Angel is an amateur historian, right? Who's grappling with past and present and all the ramifications that come with it. So, what has inspired you to take this, and more importantly, what do you hope your readers will take away from this?
History's Angel, my latest novel, is yes about a character called Alif Muhammad who sort of drifts around the older parts of Delhi with this very vivid procession of historical epochs in his head. And he's always in some historical reverie or the other. And partly it's just what we were chatting about earlier, creating a character who has given himself the luxury of daydreaming. To me, that's very important. And daydreaming, by definition, is useless. So we need space. I think we need a little more space for that. And I wanted to create a character who has no clear ambitions to do with his thinking, because he's trying to write a book and he was a promising student, but he hasn't gotten anywhere. And he's quite content with his ineffectiveness, so to speak. So for me, just that is an ideal, regardless of where I've placed him. I have placed him in very difficult times, but wherever I had placed him, for me, that would be important. But given that the times are particularly inimical to that kind of thing, he becomes even more, to me, precious, right? And that's what I want the reader to recognize. I think not everyone is going to like the guy, right? He can be a bit of a passive pain in the anatomy also, because there are moments when he should act, rise up to the challenge, and he doesn't. But I think there's still so much charm in a figure who's not, I wouldn't call him a romantic, because he also sees that history can be used in very romantic, sentimental, idealized way. And I don't think he's that, but he's moved by things. He is moved. When he's thinking about partition, he says it almost makes him cry that what he considers a grave historical blunder. And then he thinks, how can I be a historian? Because historians don't cry. So this combination of somebody who's not a cold objective type, but neither is he deluded by by the idea of history is something that you use to settle personal scores or to so-called correct the narrative. He's not at that end of things either. So he's in an uncomfortable middle place, and he's uncomfortable throughout the book, but he also is, I mean, a lot in his own head. And as long as you have the space to do that, I think we're still in a free country. I don't know. There are many ways in which that can be curtailed as well, and it needn't all be political, right? It could just be what counts for thinking, what counts for living, what counts for success. I mean, if these things change, then Aleph kind of guy gets redundant.
Uh, that reminds me, like that's quite relevant today, especially when countries all around the world are using history as a weapon. So that sort of a character also like makes a lot more. He's more relevant than ever, I'd say, right? Uh, So you mentioned in an interview previously, in an Hindustan Times interview, you said that you talked about the simultaneous presence of religious reactionary positions, as well as the consumer greed in today's age, in the zeitgeist, so to say. Uh, how do you think, if you do, these contrasting elements influence your writing, your perspective of the world, and is it challenging or is it cathartic for you, sort of, to write about this?
I think most of the time you feel completely invisible. because even though we are at this lit fest where the writer is center stage, and even though there is a certain glamour left over, sort of glamour still attached to the figure of the writer, all these things also can work against the writer because they sort of flatten out everything that's being said into one one horizon, right? And it's not a horizon. I think it's not a flat horizon. It's a landscape with lots of dips and rises and lots of things going on. So I think, yeah, I think it's a difficult time to be a writer and an easy time to be a writer. It's easy because publishing is growing. There's so many platforms through which to write. If you're not writing through the conventional ways, you're writing through the unconventional ways. It's never been easier to be heard. Never, ever has it been easier to make your voice get across, right? But at the same time, how do you just sound like yourself? And what is the self that you're going to sound like? I think that question is getting very, very hard. So when young people ask me about writing, I'm really at a loss because I want to tell them, first find out who you are, what you like, what you dislike, you know what makes you you. And if you don't have an answer to that and it's completely externalized all your questions, then no amount of technical information about writing is going to be of any use. So I think for me in these times, the best I can do, which I enjoy doing, is just describe it in a way that's as alive and as crazy as possible. Without, I don't want to satirize it or make like a political statement about it or take positions necessarily. I just want to write mildly amusing fiction about it that gives the reader joy while making her think. That's about as far as we can go with this. I think it's not always going to be a success. Certainly not always going to be read very widely, but I think to me, I hope that I will continue to feel that it's an end in itself to be able to just do that. What is the larger economy or the larger circumstances of my own life that allow me to do that? That in itself seems incredible that I can still do it. I don't think I can take that freedom lightly at all, you know? So to be able to do justice to that feeling that, hey, I can still sit down and put these words on this page and maybe somebody will read them is still an incredible feeling.
So there's this, as we talked about before as well. There's this a certain theme that cuts through all of your works, right? A person finding their place in the world. Sorry, as you were talking about how writers should know themselves as well. So that sort of bleeds into how you see the world as well, I believe. And so is that something I want to know? Is that something you start out with? Because there are more interlapping themes in your work, and they are sort of creating this universe, I'll say, of ideas, right? And do you think that search for yourself in the real world is harder today, especially with the digital times that we live in?
Yeah.
Sorry, there are many questions
No, no, that's okay. But I think you're right. I mean, I do tend to write characters who are kind of lost and at a loose end and drifting towards something, not even very ambitiously looking for their place in the world, but still there is a sense of feeling out of place. Certainly that's very strong, I think. And then the attendant question of, okay, if this is not where I belong, then where do I belong? And belonging is an obsession with me, or the lack thereof. That is definitely there. So are you asking if my own experience of that has fed into my writing, or
I just remembered you were talking about how writers, and this is something a lot of people say, which they should also give. You should understand yourself first before you write, right? So that was what. This was something I already wanted to ask you, but what you said that sort of reminded me of that again. So that was just a sort of reflection on what you said right now.
yeah, you certainly should. There should be someone in there before you can you know, start creating something like fiction. There's got to be something, it can't just be. uh, I, I'm always amused at all the debates about AI taking over writing, because I'm like, but we are more and more like AI. Like, what what is the threat that we are worried about when we ourselves are so automaton like? Yeah, we are all on factory settings already, right? Absolutely. We don't even customize the settings. We're all like AI sheep already. So what's the worry? Yeah. So I think that's very important. But I also realize, and that's partly because I write in English and see how people like myself view the world. And now with this boom in translations in India, and you're reading more of what other people are doing, and better and better, I would say, translations. There's a lot of indifferent ones, but there's some very good ones now. You also realize that there is still a tradition of writing, and you would know that coming from Calcutta. I just was talking to a very, very high-minded but very realist and gritty Tamil writer yesterday, B.J. Mohan. And yeah, and I envy the fact that he has really mixed with the mud of that culture. He really literally has, right? Whereas in the English thing, your journey is very different. More or less, you live in a metro, you go on to a particular kind of school, you have a particular kind of story, right? Which is at one remove. And of course, you can make your fiction out of that, and I've tended to. But at what point does it start to ring hollow? And what do you do about that? That feeling of hollowness, I think never leaves you. We are at one remove. And how do we get closer? And I think there is something to get closer to. It's not a chimera, I think. So that's my challenge now. I think I've written enough about the losers and the drifters and people like me, people like myself. I just want to get away from myself. If you ask me, like, what's next, I would say run, 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 run. In my head, no. I imagine calling a book that. I mean, how brilliant is it from a marketing point of view? Like, big bold font in the yeah, run, 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 run. Though Pankaj Mishra's latest novel is called Run and Hide, and one can see why it's called that. But yeah, that feeling of wanting to run away from. So I started by saying you need to have a self in order to write, but now I reached this point, 7 books down the line, where it's like, how do I escape myself? It's critical now. I have written about. I mean, I've never written exclusively personal stories or very strictly autobiographical, but of course you're channeling a lot of stuff that you know. And I need to write about stuff I don't know. I want to find out things I don't know and write about them. That's my challenge. Yeah.
That also sort of reminded what you were talking about AI. That reminded me of something that I listen often on this podcast that I listen to, Seen and the Unseen. So there's this thing that he says, ki how today when there are two people meeting, they are not two people, they are two algorithms meeting, right? So I'll have to wrap it up because we are time is. I'm just been thinking about it and it's been going on in the back of my mind. Just tell me, what are you reading right now, and are you working on something? And if you can, because it's a very tricky question, what are some of your influences? We have talked about that, but what have been some of your influences when you were growing up, so to say, if you can, please.
uh, so I'll take the last one first. Influences growing up, I think, were very, very similar to, again, people of my background, right? You're reading the English canon, and then you're reading some American modern fiction. And in my case, like I said, I was reading quite a lot of the European stuff in very good translations that was around. And I think one sort of kick in the backside was reading the new Indian writing that was coming out in the 80s, and then definitely a lot of it in the 90s. I don't think I could have become a writer if that didn't happen, obviously, because you read all that stuff, but you really get a voice when you read a novel that's set in a town like next door or somewhere further up country or down country or whatever, but you recognize it as close to home, right? That close to home quality was only there in these novels. So I think that's for me a huge influence. Even though I've been running down the English writers as a type, I think that is the biggest influence on me. All those novelists. And what am I reading right now? A wonderful book by Ram Guha and Rukun Advani called The Cooking of Books, which is about a literary friendship, a friendship between two people, both interested in good historical scholarship, one from an editorial point of view, one as a writer, and how 40 years of their friendship fed into the career of one of these men, which is Ram Guha. And I think there are very few books like that about the process, what goes on behind the scenes. We don't really care that much about the process in the West. Like the literary biography is done to death and then done to death again and then repeat ad nauseum. But here we have hardly any. And I can see why, because we have a particular Indian outlook, I think, towards too much personal detail. We aren't those kind of people. Social media has changed all that, but I think there's something in us that is shy of, you know, valorizing the self. So how do you then in that landscape write a literary biography, autobiography? But there's starting to be some good ones. I think the best book I read last year was Sarah Rai's memoir, Raw Umber. It's wonderful. She's Prem Chand's granddaughter and she writes in Hindi, but this is a book she's written in English, the first in her whole life, and she's not young. And it's just a wonderful book about being a writer or being from a writing family, an artistic family, what that means, living in the same place all her life. So it's a book about very, very, very sort of a long memory, in an era again where we're talking about the complete shattering of memory. This is a book where this person is living in a house that was built generations ago and her own memory is tied to the memories of others. So it just slows you down in a way that we need. Like, I really love the fact that it's so about such small things over such a long span of time. That's what it is. So that and Ram Guha, Rukun Advani's book. I just read B.J. Mohan, the wonderful Tamil writer. I read both his books, the stories, and so that's some of the stuff. Yeah.
And are you working on something right now?
Yeah, right now I'm trying to write a book on Shillong, which is where I grew up, which is I think the most interesting city in the Northeast, one of the most unusual places in the whole country, simply because it has always had people from everywhere and has been mixed in a way that I now see in places like Bangalore and maybe Pune, Delhi also in a certain way, but much more recently. Whereas Shillong has always had people from all over the country and all over the Northeast.
It's still rather invisible.
And it's still not that well known as a modern city. It's not been a comfortable mix always. It's often been a bumpy sort of coexistence. Sometimes it's not been a coexistence at all. But so I am trying to write like a biography, sort of. We used that word before about people, but cities also have lives. So that's what I'm trying to do. But it's nowhere near done. I'm just getting it off the ground. Thank you so much. I love the question.
Thank you so much. I hope you have great fun here.